Japan today is known worldwide as a powerhouse of technology, its cities glowing with neon lights, its rhythm modern and fast. Yet, alongside that image, there's still another Japan, one of timeless traditions, ancient temples, samurai legends, and breathtaking natural beauty. But here's something most people don't realize. This openness, this global presence, is actually a very recent chapter in Japan's long history. For more than 2 centuries, the country literally closed itself off from the outside world. This era was called Sakoku, the age of isolation. And here's the paradox. During this time of seclusion, Japanese culture didn't fade. It flourished. The economy grew, society transformed, and the traditions that we admire today, tea ceremony, bushido, the arts, were all shaped in this very period. So what exactly allowed an isolated island nation to later make one of history's greatest pivots, emerging as one of the most connected, most advanced countries in the modern world? Now let's turn back the clock to the very first chapters of Japan's story. The islands we know today as Japan have been home to people for nearly 40,000 years when the first settlers arrived from mainland Asia. They brought with them survival skills, farming, metalworking, and laid the foundation for permanent communities. Out of these roots, the earliest kingdoms of Japan began to take shape. By the 3rd century AD, southern Japan was unifying under a new seat of power, the Yamato region, ruled by a monarch known as the Emperor. From the very beginning, Japanese history was deeply shaped by the cultures of continental Asia. In 552, Buddhism arrived from Korea, ushering in a new spiritual and cultural era. Less than a century later, in 645, the sweeping Taika reforms restructured the entire government along Chinese imperial lines. At first, the imperial court had no fixed capital. Every time a new emperor took the throne, the court moved. But in 794, Emperor Kanmu made a decisive choice. He established the capital at Kyoto, opening the Heian period, an age of peace and cultural brilliance that lasted for nearly 400 years. But prosperity also carried the seeds of decline. The imperial court grew ever more extravagant, consumed by internal rivalries, and slowly lost control beyond the capital. Central authority weakened, and land fell into the hands of local nobles. A new feudal order was beginning to take shape, one where the court in Kyoto no longer held absolute power. Out of this power vacuum, warrior clans like the Taira and the Minamoto rose to prominence, laying the foundation for an entirely new era in Japanese history. Backed by the military strength of the samurai, these powerful families began to openly challenge the authority of the emperor. The court weakened further, and a bloody showdown for control of Japan became inevitable. The question was clear: who would prevail, and what new order would be born on these islands? The conflict first flared in 1160 with the Heiji Rebellion, born from disputes over imperial succession. That spark soon ignited into the Genpei War, 1180-1185, a full-scale civil war that engulfed the nation. In the end, the Minamoto clan, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, achieved a decisive victory over their rivals, the Taira. Afterward, Yoritomo established a separate military government in Kamakura, deliberately distancing his power from the imperial court in Kyoto. It was a strategic move, one that firmly separated military authority from aristocratic influence. By 1192, Yoritomo convinced Emperor Go-Toba to grant him the title of shogun, supreme commander of the expeditionary forces. With that title, Yoritomo became the true ruler of Japan, ushering in the age of the shogunate, which would last more than 700 years. From this moment on, the emperor was reduced to a symbolic figure, while real power rested in the hands of the shoguns. But the trials of the samurai were far from over. In the early 13th century, one of the greatest empires in world history, the Mongol Empire, set its sights on Japan. In 1265, Kublai Khan, the Mongol Great Khan, sent an ultimatum demanding that Japan submit as a vassal state. When Japan ignored the threat, the Mongols began preparing for full-scale invasion. In 1274, their mighty army landed on Kyushu, clashing with samurai forces badly outnumbered. And yet fate intervened. A violent storm, later called Kamikaze, the divine wind, swept in and destroyed much of the Mongol fleet. But the Mongols did not give up. In 1281, they returned with an even larger armada. Once again, disaster struck. Another powerful storm ripped through their fleet, erasing any hope of conquering Japan. Japan survived the invasions, but the cost was immense. The shogunate's treasury was drained by years of defensive efforts, and many samurai went unrewarded for their service. Discontent spread, straining the bond between the military government and the warrior clans. Seizing this moment in 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo launched a coup to restore imperial rule in Kyoto. He succeeded briefly. By 1338, he was overthrown, and shogunal power was re-established under Ashikaga Takauji. Though the shogun held power in name, in reality Japan fell under the control of regional warlords. The daimyo, each ruling their own domain, with private armies of samurai. They forged alliances, betrayed one another, and waged endless civil wars for dominance. Once again, the country descended into chaos. Central authority weakened, while local lords became kings and all but title over their territories. The most violent clash of this era erupted in 1467 with the Onin War. What began as a succession dispute over who would inherit the title of shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, soon spiraled into a nationwide conflict. Daimyo chose sides, and the result was the collapse of the feudal order. Japan fractured into a patchwork of warring mini-states, each struggling for survival in what became known as the Age of Constant Strife. This age of turmoil became known in history as Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. Throughout the 16th century, Japan was engulfed in civil war, yet it was also an era of military transformation. This was the age of the ninja, assassins moving in the shadows, and of the Sohei, Buddhist warrior monks who marched onto the battlefield. Then came a revolutionary turning point. In 1543, a Portuguese trade ship, blown off course by a storm, drifted ashore at Tanegashima Island. It was the first time Europeans set foot in Japan. They quickly opened trade routes, and each year a black ship, or kurofune, would arrive to buy and sell, bringing with it the matchlock musket, a weapon completely unknown to the Japanese. Within just over a decade, more than 300,000 muskets found their way onto Japanese battlefields. The advantage no longer belonged solely to samurai masters of the sword, but to those who could command the new power of firearms. The Portuguese also introduced Christianity, and daimyo who converted were often rewarded with trade privileges and at times direct military support from the West. Amid this upheaval, one warlord recognized the true power of this new technology and turned it into the tool of an unprecedented ambition to unify all of Japan. His name was Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga worked closely with the Portuguese, fully embracing European muskets and gunpowder. With sharp strategy and the large-scale deployment of modern weapons, he crushed some of Japan's most powerful rivals, expanding his domain and authority step by step, laying the groundwork for unifying the country. But in 1582, just as power seemed nearly within his grasp, Nobunaga was betrayed. At the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, one of his closest generals turned against him. Nobunaga took his own life as the temple burned, and his sudden death threw Japan back into chaos. Into that power vacuum stepped Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of extraordinary talent who had once been nothing more than a peasant foot soldier. Rising through the military ranks, he became a daimyo in his own right, inheriting his master's ambition. Through brilliance and determination, Hideyoshi succeeded where Nobunaga had fallen short. He unified Japan after decades of civil war. Though he became the nation's de facto ruler, Hideyoshi never accepted the title of shogun, perhaps because of his humble origins. Instead, he governed under imperial titles such as Kampaku and Daijo Daijin. Hideyoshi intended to pass power to his son, Toyotomi Hideyori. But when Hideyoshi died in 1598, Hideyori was still just a child. On his deathbed, Hideyoshi ordered his 5 most powerful retainers to swear loyalty and safeguard his heir. But honor oaths could not bind ambition. In 1600, Japan once again fell into civil war. On one side were those loyal to Toyotomi Hideyori. On the other, the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the 5 regents who had once sworn loyalty to the Toyotomi clan. The decisive showdown came at Sekigahara, the largest battle in Japanese history. Tokugawa Ieyasu won a resounding victory, ending the chaos of the Sengoku era and ushering in a new age, the Tokugawa shogunate. From 1603 onward, the Tokugawa ruled Japan for 268 years. This was the Edo period, a rare age of peace and stability that allowed Japanese art, culture, and economy to flourish. But stability came at a price. To maintain social order, the Tokugawa enforced strict policies, especially toward Christianity. Fearing that foreign faith might undermine their rule, the shogunate carried out brutal persecutions, eventually banning Christianity altogether in 1638. Thousands of believers were executed, while the survivors went underground, worshipping in secrecy and fear. By 1639, Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu enacted Sakoku, the policy of national seclusion. Japan shut its doors to the outside world. Citizens were forbidden to leave, ocean-going ships were destroyed, and foreign trade was restricted only to China, Korea, and the Dutch. Confined to the small artificial island of Dejima, off Nagasaki, the nation entered centuries of isolation. And yet, in this very seclusion, Japan's identity was forged more deeply than ever. Through that tiny trade window, Japan maintained a fragile link to the West, absorbing scattered knowledge of science and technology. The 17th century under Tokugawa rule was one of prosperity. The population doubled to nearly 30 million, roads and schools were built, and the economy and society grew in stability. A dazzling urban culture began to flourish. Kabuki theater and ukiyo-e woodblock prints became icons of the Edo era. Japan seemed to have found a formula for stability and isolation. But beyond its shores, the world was moving fast. The Industrial Revolution was fueling Western powers with a growing hunger for markets and resources. By the late 18th century, cracks started to show. Agricultural growth stalled, and when a devastating famine struck in the 1830s, the shogunate's weak response spread anger and unrest. Meanwhile, Western knowledge trickled in through Dutch books, exposing just how far Japan was falling behind in science and technology. Then, isolation ended abruptly. In 1853, an American fleet under Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay. His black ships, belching coal smoke and bristling with modern cannons, shocked both the government and the people. Faced with overwhelming firepower, the Tokugawa shogunate had no choice but to yield, signing treaties that opened Japan to the United States. After more than 2 centuries of seclusion, Japan's gates were forced wide open, and its destiny would never be the same. The concessions quickly spread to other Western powers, like Britain and Russia. This humiliation ignited outrage at home, especially among southern domains like Choshu and Satsuma, who already bore old grudges against the Tokugawa. Rallying under the slogan, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," they formed an alliance. In 1868, the young Emperor Meiji issued an imperial edict ending the Tokugawa shogunate. The Boshin War broke out, and in a matter of months the shogunate collapsed. After nearly 700 years, the era of the shoguns was over. Real power returned to the emperor. In 1869, the court moved to Edo, renamed Tokyo, marking the dawn of a new age. A top-down revolution was about to begin, a revolution that would change Japan forever. That new era was called the Meiji Restoration. Under the leadership of Emperor Meiji and a group of reformers, Japan embarked on a breathtaking sprint to modernize, driven by a single goal: to become a strong, united nation that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the West. The slogan of the time was simple but powerful: rich nation, strong army. The Meiji government poured its energy into transforming the country. Railroads and telegraphs stretched across the land. Schools were opened to bring education to every child. The ban on Christianity was lifted. Hundreds of foreign experts were brought in to share knowledge in fields like mining, banking, law, and transportation, accelerating Japan's leap into modernity. At the heart of it all was the military. The old samurai system was gradually dismantled, replaced by a standing army modeled after the West, equipped with the latest weapons and tactics. In just a few decades, Japan went from an isolated feudal state to a rising modern power. In 1877, that new army faced its first great test: the Satsuma Rebellion, the last stand of the traditional samurai. Brave warriors drew their swords one final time against rifles and cannons. But the outcome was inevitable. Outmatched by modern weapons and modern strategy, the samurai were defeated. Their fall marked the end of an age and the beginning of Japan's future as a modern nation. From here on, Japan's new military power wasn't just about defending the homeland, it became the tool for expansion. After consolidating control over Hokkaido and annexing the Ryukyu Islands, Japan set its sights further outward, toward China and Korea. In the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, a modern, well-organized Japanese army crushed the much larger Qing forces, securing control of Taiwan. Just a few years later, in 1902, Japan signed a military alliance with Great Britain, a bold move aimed at countering the growing threat from Russia. That showdown came quickly. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, exploded into one of the defining conflicts of the era. Against all expectations, Japan emerged victorious, most famously at the Battle of Tsushima, where its new navy nearly wiped out the Russian fleet. For the first time in centuries, an Asian power had decisively defeated a Western one. The victory shocked the world and cemented Japan's role as the rising power in East Asia. By 1910, Japan annexed Korea, extending its control beyond the archipelago. No longer just a regional force, Japan had stepped onto the global stage as Asia's first modern empire, and this imperial road was only beginning. Encouraged by its victories and fueled by ambition, Japan entered World War I on the side of the Allies, targeting German colonies across the South Pacific. When the war ended, Japan not only walked away with new territories, but also with a seat at the League of Nations, recognized as one of the world's emerging great powers. But like many nations in the post-war years, Japan began to experience a surge of radical nationalism, an ideology with fascist undertones that took hold especially within the military. And it was this wave of thought that would steer the nation toward a conflict far greater and far more destructive than anything before. As the militarists gained increasing control, Japan was pulled onto a dangerous path of expansion. That ambition erupted into the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, as Japanese forces seized vast territories across China, drawing international condemnation and suspicion. To contain Japan's aggression, the United States imposed harsh economic sanctions, cutting off vital supplies of oil, steel, and other resources critical for war. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, Japan sought partners who shared its expansionist vision. In 1940, it signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, pushing its ties with the West, and especially the U.S., to the breaking point. Japan pressed further into Southeast Asia, occupying colonies held by Britain, the Netherlands, and France. And finally, under the leadership of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the government made a fateful choice: launch a preemptive strike against the United States, shattering the blockade and securing the empire's new conquests. December 7, 1941. The skies over the Pacific erupted in fire. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In a single stroke, America was pulled into World War II, and what had been a regional conflict now became a truly global war. In the early months, Japan scored lightning victories, sweeping across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, even the Dutch East Indies, one by one fell to Japanese forces. The empire of the rising sun now stretched across Asia and the Pacific, reaching the very peak of its power. But that same ambition marked the beginning of an even greater tragedy. As Japan expanded, the Allies, led by the United States, regrouped and launched a massive counteroffensive. The focus shifted to tiny islands, strategic footholds whose airfields could bring bombers within striking range of the Japanese homeland. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa came to define this brutal struggle. Japanese troops fought to the last man. American forces paid with tens of thousands of lives. The fighting was so ferocious that U.S. commanders realized an invasion of Japan itself would mean casualties on an almost unimaginable scale. The solution chosen was a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. Secret, terrifying, and devastating. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In an instant, more than 100,000 people were killed, with tens of thousands more dying in the years that followed from radiation. The scale of destruction was unimaginable. Japan's leaders could no longer deny the truth. On August 14th, Japan sent its message of unconditional surrender to the Allies. And the very next day, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio, the first time his people had ever heard his voice, announcing that the war was over. For a country taught to fight to the last man, the act of surrender was a shock beyond words. World War II had ended, but Japan lay in ruins, its cities flattened, its people exhausted, and its future uncertain. After the war, Japan came under Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur. A sweeping reconstruction began. The military was dismantled and a new constitution was drafted, one that renounced Japan's right to wage war. Emperor Hirohito was allowed to keep his throne, but he was forced to publicly renounce his divine status, a belief that had been the spiritual backbone of the nation for centuries. Under Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, Japan abandoned an aggressive foreign policy and focused entirely on rebuilding its economy. With discipline, hard work, and resilience, the Japanese people set about rebuilding their country from the ashes. By 1955, Japan's economy had already surpassed its pre-war levels, and just over a decade later, by 1968, Japan had become the world's second-largest capitalist economy. In the decades that followed, Japan cemented its global position in automobiles and electronics. A consumer boom was underway, with brands like Toyota, Honda, Sony, and Panasonic becoming international icons of quality and innovation. These post-war achievements shaped the modern Japan we know today, a nation ranked among the top in the world in economics, technology, education, and life expectancy. All of it was built on the perseverance and determination of its people. From a closed feudal society to a militant empire, and finally to a peaceful economic powerhouse, Japan's journey stands as one of the great stories of the 20th century, a testament to the extraordinary ability of a nation to rise again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment, share it, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into history. Until next time.